Back in the summer of 2008, my family had planned a vacation to Shadowland, a brand new theme park that had recently opened up in my home state of Oregon. It had been a tough year with my dad losing his job, but things were starting to look up after he managed to find some work on a construction site. So, despite the recession at the time, we were just about able to afford this trip. But little did I know that I would see something on this trip that would still haunt me over a decade later. I still remember, as we drove through the winding roads that led to the park, I was so excited, but to be honest, I was also a bit nervous. It didn't help that the forest around us was thick and dark, with the trees casting long shadows that almost seemed to reach out and grab us. But as we approached the park's entrance, my fear quickly turned into fascination. The park was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was absolutely huge, and you could see roller coasters spilling out of the site. The entrance was marked by a giant archway that glowed with a bright welcome sign, and as soon as we stepped through, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy hit me almost immediately. Even my parents were giddy with excitement, eager to explore the park and try out all the rides. My younger brother was jumping up and down with anticipation, but as we made our way through the different sections of the park, I had this strange feeling that something was watching us. It's hard to describe, but I just found it really difficult to enjoy myself after that, as there was this dark cloud in my mind. The park was divided into different sections, each with its own unique theme. The first section we visited was called the Haunted Woods. It was filled with trees that looked as if they were dead, and the paths were lined with eerie lanterns that flickered in the wind. The rides were all designed to scare you. There was a haunted house that promised to be the scariest in the world, a roller coaster that went through a graveyard, and even a Ferris wheel that stopped at the top to give you a bird's eye view of the park. But the most unsettling thing about the Haunted Woods was the woman with black eyes. She seemed to be following us wherever we went, her eyes fixed on me. She was tall and thin, with long black hair that seemed to flow in the wind. She wore a long black dress and her skin was pale, almost translucent. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me, just waiting for something. But I remember at first trying to convince myself she was just part of the theme park, and it was all just an act. Anyway, we moved on to the next section. This one was called the Dark Circus. This area was filled with clowns, but they weren't the kind you would see at a normal circus. They had twisted smiles and sharp teeth, and their eyes seemed to follow you wherever you went. The rides in this section were even more terrifying. There was a spinning ride that made you feel like you were being thrown around by an actual clown, a roller coaster that went through a clown's mouth, and also a house of mirrors that distorted your reflection, but in the most unsettling way. As we walked through the dark circus, I couldn't help but feel like we were being led somewhere. I mean, the woman with black eyes was always there, watching us from a distance. Her eyes seemed to glow in the dark, and I could see her long, bony fingers twitching as if she was eager to grab me. We then moved on to the next section, the Twilight Zone. This area was filled with strange and otherworldly rides. There was a maze that promised to take you to another dimension, this spinning ride that made you feel like you were floating in space, and of course, a haunted hotel that promised to give you nightmares for weeks. It was here that I had the most terrifying encounter with the woman with black eyes. We were on a ride that took us through a dark tunnel, and I saw her standing at the end of it. She was staring right at me, her eyes glowing with a strange light. As we got closer, I could see that she was holding something in her hand, a black, twisted object that for the life of me I couldn't seem to identify. I screamed, but no one else seemed to notice her. My parents told me that I was just imagining things, but I knew what I had seen. We then moved on to the final section of the park, the gates of hell. In terms of the actual sections to the park, this one was probably the scariest of all, with rides that promised to take you to the darkest corners of your soul. There was a ride that made you feel like you were falling into a pit of fire, and a haunted mansion that promised to be the most terrifying experience of your life. But despite my usually darker nature, I couldn't enjoy any of it. The woman with black eyes was always there, watching me from a distance. I could feel her presence everywhere, and I knew that she was waiting for me. It wasn't until we were about to leave the park that things took a turn for the worse. I had to use the restroom, and my mum told me to go ahead while they waited outside. I made my way to the bathroom, feeling a sense of unease creeping over me. It was empty, and as I stood in front of the sink washing my hands, I heard a noise behind me. I turned around, and there she was, standing in the doorway. She took a step towards me, and I screamed, backing away from her. I tried to run, but she grabbed me, her fingers digging into my skin. I kicked and fought, but she was too strong. And then, suddenly, my mum was there, pulling her off of me. We ran out of the bathroom, and I didn't stop until we were safely back in the car. I never went back to Shadowland again, and I never forgot the woman with the black eyes. To this day, I still don't know if she was part of the theme park, or if she was just some strange woman taking advantage of the situation, but I do know that I will never forget the terror that I felt that day. I've always been a darker person, fascinated by abandoned places and the idea of exploring them at night. So when my friends suggested that we explore an abandoned theme park, I jumped at the opportunity. We arrived at the park just as the sun began to set. It looked eerie, with the rusted gates and broken down rides. At the time, I'm pretty sure it had been abandoned for around 10 years. There were a few rumours going around, but none of us really knew why it shut down in the first place. All we knew was that the silence was deafening as we walked through the empty paths within its walls. As we approached the old Ferris wheel, I could have sworn that I heard the faint sound of children laughing. I looked to my friends, but they didn't seem to notice it, so I brushed it off, thinking it must just be my imagination. But then I heard the sound even louder this time, and everybody looked at each other. Without saying a word, we followed the laughter to the Ferris wheel, but there was nobody there. As we continued through the park, we would hear strange noises coming from different attractions within the park. We would always hesitate, but our curiosity got the best of us, and we decided to investigate. There was this one building, and inside the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the air was so musty. We could hear what sounded like footsteps coming from upstairs, but we just assumed it must be rats or something, as nobody could be up there. But then suddenly, we heard the sound of a door creaking open. We all looked at each other, wondering who or what could be opening that door. This is when we decided to creep up the stairs, and as we reached the top, a gust of wind slammed the door shut behind us. We were now trapped, left alone with the footsteps which were now getting closer. Panic started to set in as we tried to open the door, but failed miserably. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and as I turned around, I saw a figure in the darkness, its eyes glowing red. We could do nothing but run around in the room screaming for help, but of course, nobody came. Eventually, one of my friends started ramming himself against the door, and soon we all joined in, managing to break down the door and sprinting out of that building as fast as we could. We ran towards the entrance to the park, but just before we jumped over the gates, we looked back, and that's when we saw it, a ghostly figure standing in front of one of the attractions, staring directly at us. Its face was contorted in an expression of anger and hatred, and its eyes were a deep shade of black. We were all frozen with fear, unable to move or speak, despite us all wanting to just get the hell out of there. And that's when the figure started to move towards us, its arms outstretched. We could hear its raspy breaths getting closer and closer, and the hairs on the back of our necks stood on end. But then, just as it was about to reach us, the figure vanished into thin air. It felt almost like a warning, and we were left shaken and terrified. Well, eventually we managed to gain enough courage to just climb over the gate and leave, but as we left the park, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The experience has left us all traumatized, and we never really speak of it. I guess we got what we went there for, because the abandoned theme park had really lived up to its haunted reputation. It was the first Friday in October, and I was standing outside Thorpe Park's entrance, anxiously waiting for my friends to arrive. The park is famous for its Fright Night events, and I was excited to experience all the scary mazes and attractions that they would have on offer. I had heard that they went all out for the events, with actors dressed as zombies, ghosts, and other creepy characters lurking around every corner. It was supposed to be the ultimate Halloween experience. As soon as my friends arrived, we headed straight for the first maze. The line was long, but we were all hyped up and eager to get started. We finally made our way through the entrance and into the maze. It was dark and the air was thick with a fog. We could hear screams and eerie noises coming from all directions. My heart was pounding and my palms were sweating. It was all so intense and so real. As we made our way through the maze, I noticed one of the actors was dressed as a clown, with a white and red outfit and face paint that made him look even more sinister. He had a red balloon in his hand and was staring at me intently. His eyes were piercing, and I felt like he was staring right into my soul. It was unnerving, but I tried to shake it off, thinking that it was just all part of the experience. But as we exited the maze, I noticed the same actor following us out. He was still holding the red balloon and was now walking faster, trying to keep up with our pace. I watched as he stalked us from a distance, his eyes never leaving us. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I knew something was definitely off. Feeling uneasy, I suggested that we move on to the next maze, but as we made our way there, I felt like we were being followed once again. I turned around and saw the same actor from before, but this time he was much closer, his eyes only locked on me. I tried to keep calm and told my friends to quicken their pace, but I could feel his presence right behind me the whole way. And then suddenly, I felt a pair of hands grab me from behind. It was the clown actor, and he had snuck up on me with his hands tightly gripping my arms. My friends tried to pull me away, but the actor was too strong. I was struggling to break free, my heart racing, when I heard a loud commotion coming from the other side of the maze. Other actors dressed as zombies and ghosts had come to our rescue. They were yelling and pushing the clown actor away from us, using their fake weapons to keep him at bay. The actor seemed to snap out of his daze and started to fight back, but the other actors managed to subdue him and take him away. We were all in shock and had to be escorted out of the park. I couldn't believe that such a terrifying experience had happened to me. It all felt so real, so intense. I was shaking, and I couldn't stop crying. The authorities later revealed that the actor who had attacked us was a psychopath who had infiltrated the event to cause harm. He wasn't actually an actor in the park, and he had a history of violence. It was a wake-up call for the park and for all of us who thought that we were in a safe place. I never went back to Thorpe Park after that incident. The memory of his face still haunts me to this day, and I still get chills whenever I think back to that night. It's a reminder that even in places that are supposed to be safe and fun, danger can always lurk in the shadows. I had always loved roller coasters. The rush of adrenaline you get when soaring high above the ground and then plunging back down at breakneck speeds. I mean, what's not to love? So when my parents surprised me with a trip to the new amusement park that had opened up on the outskirts of town, I was beyond excited. We arrived at the park early in the morning, the sun just starting to rise above the horizon. The park was still relatively empty, giving us plenty of time to explore before the crowds started pouring in. We made our way to the largest roller coaster in the park, a towering metal behemoth with twisting tracks that seemed to go on forever. We waited in line for what felt like hours, the anticipation building with every passing minute. Finally, we were strapped into our seats and the roller coaster began to ascend the first hill. As we reached the top, I could see the entire park spread out before me. The rides and attractions were now mere specks in the distance. But then, something went wrong. The coaster suddenly jolted to a stop, leaving us suspended at the very top of the ride. I felt sick as I looked down at the ground far below, now worried that I may be stuck. Suddenly I heard a strange sound coming from somewhere behind me. It was a low growl, deep and menacing, like nothing I had ever heard before. I turned my head to see where the sound was coming from, but there was nothing there. But that's when I saw it. A strange creature, unlike anything I had ever seen before, had appeared in the cart with us. Its skin was a sickly green, with bulging eyes and sharp, jagged teeth. It stared at us with a look of pure hatred, its gaze lingering on me for what felt like an eternity. I could feel its hot breath on my face, and I could smell the putrid stench emanating from its body. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The other passengers were equally terrified, paralyzed with fear, as the creature inched closer and closer to all of us. But just as it seemed like the creature was about to attack, the coaster suddenly lurched forward, hurtling us down the track at breakneck speed. Before I had a chance to even look, the creature had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. but the image was still seared into my mind forever. We made it safely back to the platform, where park staff quickly ushered us off the ride and led us to a quiet corner of the park. They assured us that there was just a glitch in the system, and that it wouldn't happen again. But something about the way they took us aside made me feel quite strange. Well, after the park staff left, we all stayed put, talking and discussing what we had seen. Since that day, I have never been back to that amusement park again, and I'll never forget the strange creature that appeared on the roller coaster. I still wonder if it was some kind of incredible 3D effect, but to this day, I've never heard of a roller coaster that has anything remotely similar to what I experienced. So it's difficult for me to move on when I don't really understand what happened. Even now, years later, the image of its bulging eyes and razor-sharp teeth haunts me in my dreams, and I don't know if I will ever truly move on. My family and I had planned a trip to one of the biggest and most popular theme parks in the country. We were in California, and I think that's as much as I can say. My little brother was thrilled, but I wasn't as excited as I thought I would be. Something just felt off from the moment that we arrived. We got there early in the morning and started exploring the various attractions. As we walked through the park, I started to notice a man who seemed to be following us. He was tall and thin, with dark, piercing eyes that seemed to be staring right through me. He wore all black, and his clothes were old and ragged. At first, I tried to ignore him, thinking that he was just another visitor. But no matter where we went, he was always there. I mean, he was in line with us for the roller coaster, he stood in front of us as we waited for the Ferris wheel, and he even followed us into the food court. The coincidences were adding up, and soon it became quite apparent that this man was, in fact, following us. As the day went on, I just started to feel more and more uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was dangerous somehow, with his eyes seeming to follow us everywhere we went, and I could feel his stare burning into my soul. My parents noticed that I seemed tense and tried to reassure me that everything was fine, but that didn't do much good. As the sun started to set, we decided to go on one last ride before we left the park, a slow boat ride that wound through a dark underground tunnel. To be honest, I thought that being in an enclosed space where nobody could get me would make me feel a lot safer, but I was so wrong. As the boat made its way through the tunnel, I heard a voice behind me. It was the man, and he was speaking in a low, menacing whisper. I turned around, and that's when I saw him sitting behind us, his eyes fixed on me. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was closing up. I couldn't move, and there was no way to escape. That ride felt like it lasted forever, but finally, it was over. As we stepped off the boat, I turned to look for the man, but he was nowhere to be seen. I wanted to tell my parents what had happened, but I was too afraid to speak. That night I barely slept, just imagining the man's dark, piercing eyes staring at me, and I knew he was still out there, somewhere, just waiting for me. Well, it's safe to say, I will never go back to that theme park ever again. It was a bright and sunny day when my friends and I decided to visit the theme park in our town. We were all excited to ride the roller coasters and play the games, and as soon as we entered the park, I could feel the adrenaline rush through my veins. We started off with some of the milder rides to warm up, and then moved on to the bigger ones. The screams and laughter from the other visitors filled the air and added to the excitement of the day. I was having the time of my life, until I noticed that person in an animal costume. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, but then I saw the same animal everywhere I went. I brushed it off as a weird coincidence, but as the day went on, I started to feel very uneasy. It was like I was being watched by whoever was in that costume, and it was making me incredibly uncomfortable. I tried to just shake the feeling off, but the stalker kept appearing around every corner. I could smell the musty odor coming from the costume, and it made me nauseous. When I listened carefully, I could even hear the sound of the stalker's heavy breathing and footsteps, which made my heart race with fear. It was like whenever I was alone, the stalker was there, and he would progressively get closer and closer to me. It was like he was intentionally trying to intimidate me. Well, once I was back with my friends, I finally decided to confront him and ask him why he was following me. But as I turned around, I was met with a blank stare from inside the animal mask. The stalker didn't say a word, but I could feel the tension in the air. At this point, I knew I had to get away, so I tried to lose him by going on some of the rides and hiding in the crowds, but somehow he always seemed to find me. It was almost like the more I tried to get away from him, the more persistent he became. As the sun started to set, the park began to empty out, and I noticed that the stalker had started to become more aggressive. His breathing had become substantially heavier, and I knew that I had to do something. So I ran towards the nearest security officer, but just before I could reach him, the stalker grabbed me. He then dragged me away down what looked like a dark alleyway within the theme park, and locked me in a storage room. I remember the room was pitch black, and I could feel my heart pounding as I screamed for help, but the stalker had tied a cloth around my mouth, muffling my screams. I could smell the musty scent of the animal costume mixed with the stalker's sweat. I was truly trapped in there, and time was passing by so slowly. I was so convinced that this was the end. Suddenly I heard the sound of the door open, and I looked up to see the outline of a security officer in the doorway. He quickly untied me. I was shaking and crying, but the security officer assured me that I was now safe. Apparently they had caught the man, and he was later identified as a former park employee who had been fired for inappropriate behavior. Well, I did survive that day, but the experience has truly left me traumatized, and I never want to visit that theme park again, no matter what. It was the summer before my senior year of high school, and my parents had decided to take me and my little sister on a road trip. We were starting in our hometown and travelling down the coast to visit different states and attractions. Our first stop was a well-known theme park that my parents had always wanted to take us to. My little sister was ecstatic about the idea of spending the day riding roller coasters and going on water rides, and I couldn't wait to try out all the park's famous treats. We arrived early in the morning, just as the park was opening. I remember the sun was shining and the air was crisp, making it the perfect day to be outside. As we walked through the park, my parents pointed out different attractions and rides that they had remembered from their own childhoods. I couldn't help but smile as I watched my little sister's face light up with excitement at every turn. As the day wore on, the park did become more crowded and the lines for the rides grew even longer. But despite this, we were having a great time. We had just finished up on one of the biggest roller coasters in the park, when suddenly, the lights on the ride flickered. At first we thought it was just a minor glitch, but then the ride jerked to a stop, and the emergency lights came on. At this point, the power had gone out in the entire park, leaving everything in complete darkness. Screams and cries could be heard echoing through the park, as people stumbled around, trying to find their way out. My parents immediately grabbed my sister's hand and told me to follow closely behind, as we made our way to the nearest exit. But as we walked, the darkness seemed to swallow us up, making it nearly impossible to see where we were going. As we turned a corner, we heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the ride that we had just been on. My heart raced as I turned to look, but the darkness prevented me from seeing anything. My little sister began to cry, her sobs adding to the eerie silence that surrounded us. The grip that my parents had on my hand started to tighten as we tried to navigate our way through the maze of attractions. Just as we were about to reach the exit, I heard a strange whispering sound coming from behind us. I turned to look, but all I could see was the faint outline of a figure in the darkness. It was then that I realized that we were being followed. We walked faster, but the whispers grew louder, almost like they were right beside us. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the darkness and grabbed my little sister's arm. My parents immediately pulled her towards them, but the hand wouldn't let go. In a panic, we all started to scream for help, but it felt like there was no one around to hear us. The hand's grip grew tighter and tighter, making my sister cry out in pain. But just as I thought we were doomed, a group of security guards appeared out of nowhere. They pried the hand away from my sister and pulled us towards safety. As we were escorted out of the park, I couldn't help but wonder what had caused the power outage and who the mysterious figure in the darkness had been. Well, after what felt like an eternity, the power finally came back on. The lights flickered back to life, illuminating the darkened park once again. As we stood on the other side of the exit doors, we were met by what looked like hundreds of other guests who were all discussing similar experiences to the one that we experienced. There was this one family that we spoke to that said they couldn't find their daughter. My dad even offered to go back into the park to try and find her, but the security officers wouldn't let him, saying it was too dangerous. Well, we waited around for a few more hours, hoping that she would return, but in the end there was nothing we could do. We went back to our car, and my parents swore that we would just drive home. After this traumatic experience, none of us really wanted to continue on the road trip. Well, years have now passed, and my family and I still reminisce about the traumatic events of that night. We never found out if that family's daughter was found safe and sound, but we can only hope that she was okay. I was excited to spend the day at the new theme park that had just opened up in town. My family and I had been looking forward to it for weeks. As soon as we entered the park, we were greeted by a group of friendly clowns handing out balloons. I couldn't help but smile at their silly antics, but one clown caught my attention in particular. He was tall and thin, with a painted-on smile that looked more like a grimace. His eyes were sunken and dark, and his voice was low and raspy. He introduced himself as Jester and offered to take a photo with me and my family. As we walked through the park, I started to notice that Jester seemed to be everywhere that we went. He would pop up out of nowhere, his face inches away, and then disappear just as quickly. I started to feel very uneasy by this, and my parents noticed that I was getting upset. My mum tried to reassure me, explaining that he was just a clown and he was supposed to be funny. But Jester didn't seem very funny to me. He seemed more sinister, like he was hiding something behind that painted-on smile. I tried to avoid him, but no matter where we went in the park, he was always there. As the day wore on, I started to notice that the other clowns seemed to be avoiding Jester. Whenever he would join them, they would seem to scurry away as if they were afraid of him or disliked him in some way. I wondered if I was the only one who felt like something was off about him. Late in the afternoon, my parents and brother decided to go on a roller coaster, but I didn't feel like going on any more rides. I told them I would meet them at the exit and started walking toward the nearest bathroom. But before I could get there, Jester appeared in front of me, blocking my path. "Where are you going, little girl?" he asked, his voice taking on a menacing tone. I'm just going to the bathroom," I stammered. "You don't want to go in there," he said, shaking his head. "It's not safe, but I know a much better place. Here, follow me." I didn't want to follow him, but I felt like I didn't have any other choice. He led me to a dark corner of the park where a small tent was set up. It was covered in black and white stripes, like a circus tent, but there was no sign or name on it. Jester led me inside, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The interior of the tent was dark and cramped, with flickering lights casting strange shadows all over the walls. Jester pulled out a deck of cards and started shuffling them, his eyes fixed on mine. "Pick a card, any card," he said, holding out the deck. I reached for a card, but before I could touch it, Jester snatched the deck away. His smile had disappeared, replaced by a scowl. "You're not like the others," he said, his voice cold and angry. "You're special. You can see through the illusion." I tried to back away, but he grabbed my arm, holding me in place. I could feel his breath on my face, and that's when I knew I was in real danger. Suddenly, there was a loud banging on the side of the tent. It was my dad, calling out for my name. Jester released me and disappeared out of one of the exit doors, leaving me alone in the tent. I rushed out, relieved to see my dad waiting for me outside. He could see the terror in my eyes and immediately asked me what was wrong. I told him everything about the clown, and he listened to me carefully, and we decided to go straight to the park management to report the incident. Well, after a long wait, we finally got to speak to the management and reported everything. They told us that they didn't have any employee by the name of Jester, and that they would launch an investigation immediately. My family and I left the park that day, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that Jester was still watching us. Days went by, and we didn't hear back from the park management. My parents had already decided to forget about the incident and move on, but I couldn't forget. I can never forget. Every time I close my eyes, I see Jester's face. But I remember one day, when I was watching the news, a story caught my attention. It was about a series of disappearances that had been occurring in the area. the newscaster reported that one of the victims had been last seen at the very same theme park we had visited. My heart sank as I realized that Jester may be the one responsible for those disappearances. My family and I went straight to the authorities and told them everything we knew about Jester and the tent. They investigated and actually found out that the man behind the Jester costume was a criminal on the run from the law, and had been using the theme park as a cover for his illegal activities. They finally caught him and brought him to justice, but the trauma of that day has still never left me. I never went back to that theme park even after he was caught, and I still shudder whenever I see a clown or anything resembling Jester's face. Thank you for listening, and make sure to check out the on-screen playlist for more scary stories.